She looks perfect, but she understands nothing, Richard Bennett said in smooth, effortless French, his voice low enough to seem private, but loud enough to carry across the candlelit table as a ripple of soft laughter followed. Glasses clinking under warm amber lights in a Manhattan penthouse that overlooked miles of glittering skyline. And Sophia Bennett, seated beside him in a simple ivory dress, didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react, her fingers resting lightly on the stem of her wine. Glass as if the words had passed through her like air, invisible, weightless, unimportant. While across from them Claire Du Bois tilted her head with a knowing smile, replying in rapid French, sharper this time, her tone laced with amusement that danced just beneath politeness, and a few guests leaned in, pretending not to listen while clearly enjoying the performance unfolding in a language they assumed was safe, a language they believed created a wall Sophia could never cross. And Richard chuckled again, more confident now, adding another comment under his breath, something about beauty and silence, something about how easy life was when complexity didn't speak back. And still Sophia remained still, her posture relaxed, her expression soft, almost distant, as if her mind had drifted somewhere far beyond the room, beyond the laughter, beyond him. And yet there was something subtle, something nearly invisible. The slightest tightening at the corner of her eyes, the faintest pause. In her breathing, a shift so small no one noticed. No one except the silence that seemed to gather slowly around her like a held breath. And Claire, emboldened, leaned forward, her French growing faster, more intricate, almost playful in its cruelty as she tested the boundaries of what could be said without consequence. Her words flowing like a private joke shared between equals, excluding the one person who sat at the center of it all, and Richard nodded along, enjoying the rhythm of it, enjoying the control, the quiet superiority that came from speaking freely without fear of being understood. And then, just as the laughter began to swell again, just as the moment settled into something comfortably dismissive, Sophia gently set her glass down against the marble table, the soft click cutting through the air like a line drawn across a page. And for the first time that evening, she lifted her eyes directly to Claire, then to Richard, her gaze calm, steady, unreadable, as if she had been waiting, not reacting, not enduring, but waiting. And in that stillness, something shifted, something no one could yet name, but everyone could feel, like the moment just before a storm breaks, when the air grows heavy and the world seems to pause, holding itself together for one final second before everything changes. No one spoke at first, not because they were confused, but because something in Sophia's stillness made it impossible to pretend the moment had not shifted. The chandelier above them seemed too bright now, every reflection sharper, every breath louder against the quiet, and Richard gave a small laugh, the kind people use to smooth over tension, as he reached for his glass again, as if nothing had happened, as if the world had not just tilted slightly off its axis. Anyway, he said in English, this time his tone casual, controlled. We were just discussing business projections for next quarter. But his voice did not quite land the same way it had minutes ago. It felt thinner, stretched, and Claire noticed it too, her smile returning, but tighter, now more calculated, as she leaned back in her chair, crossing one leg over the other, studying Sophia with a new kind of curiosity, not dismissive anymore, but cautious. You looked like you had something to say, Claire said lightly, her words polished, her accent precise, every syllable placed carefully, like pieces on a chessboard. And Sophia did not answer immediately. She let the silence breathe, let it grow just enough that everyone at the table felt it pressing gently against their attention, before she lifted her glass again, not to drink, but to turn it slightly, watching the light bend through the liquid. Her voice, when it came, was soft, almost thoughtful. I was just listening, she said, and there was something in the way she said it that made listening sound like an action, not a passive state, but a choice, a deliberate act. And Richard nodded. Quickly, too quickly. Right, of course, he said, forcing a smile. You always are. And a few people chuckled uncertainly, unsure where to place themselves in this new version of the moment, while Claire tilted her head again, her eyes narrowing, just slightly. Listening can be dangerous, she replied, slipping back into French for that last sentence, as if testing a boundary, as if drawing a line in the sand to see who would cross it. And this time the shift was unmistakable. Several guests glanced at Sophia, then away, then back again, waiting for a reaction that did not come, at least not yet. because Sophia simply set her glass down once more, her fingers lingering on the cool surface for half a second longer than necessary. Her posture still relaxed, her shoulders loose, but her eyes now fully present, no longer distant, no longer drifting somewhere else. And in that quiet, controlled space, she spoke again, still in English, still calm. "It depends on what you are willing to hear," and the words landed. Differently, heavier, not loud, but impossible to ignore, and Richard felt it, the subtle unraveling of something he could not quite name, his confidence slipping just a fraction as he cleared his throat, adjusting his cufflinks, an unnecessary gesture, a reflex of control, while across from him Claire leaned forward, just slightly, her interest now fully engaged, no longer playing for amusement, but for understanding, and beneath the table Sophia's hand rested still against her lap, steady, grounded, unmoved, as if whatever came next had already been decided long before this dinner, long before this moment, long before anyone at that table had realized they were no longer the ones in control. Claire's smile returned, but it was different now, thinner edged with something sharper, as she leaned forward just enough for the candlelight to catch in her eyes, and without breaking eye contact, she spoke again in French, slower this time, each word deliberate, as if she wanted to be understood by everyone except the one person she still believed was outside the conversation. "It must be peaceful to sit at a table like this and not carry the weight of understanding." A few guests shifted in their seats, sensing the tension, but saying nothing, while Richard exhaled softly, a quiet, amused breath, as though he had just been handed the perfect line to continue the game. "Exactly," he replied in French, his tone lighter, now more confident again. "Ignorance has its advantages, it keeps things simple." And this time the laughter that followed was hesitant, uneven, not quite landing the way it had before, because something about Sophia's stillness had begun to change the room itself, like a subtle shift in temperature that no one could ignore. And Sophia lifted her gaze fully now, not glancing, not drifting, but looking directly at Claire first, then at Richard, her expression calm, almost thoughtful, as if she were considering something, carefully weighing it before deciding whether it was worth saying at all. And for a brief moment, it seemed like she might let it pass, like she might return to that quiet, invisible presence they had all assigned to her. But instead she drew in a slow breath. Not dramatic, not loud, just enough to center herself. And then she spoke in French, her voice smooth, clear, and unmistakably fluent. Peaceful perhaps, but only for those who are not being discussed. The words landed softly but with precision, each syllable perfectly placed like a key sliding into a lock, and the effect was immediate. The air shifted completely. The quiet that followed was no longer passive, it was absolute. And Richard froze, his fingers still wrapped around the stem of his glass, as if movement itself had become uncertain, while Claire's expression flickered just for a fraction of a second, the smallest crack in her composure before she recovered, but not fully, not convincingly. Because something fundamental had changed the rules of the room, and Sophia did not stop there. She tilted her head slightly, her tone still calm, still composed, but now carrying a quiet authority that had not been there before, or perhaps had always been there waiting. "Also," she continued gently, "if you are going to speak about simplicity, you might want to choose your words more carefully. Your phrasing earlier was grammatically inconsistent." A few guests inhaled sharply, one of them letting out a soft, involuntary laugh that quickly died in the silence as Claire's posture stiffened, her confidence slipping just enough to reveal the uncertainty beneath it, and Richard blinked once, then again, as if trying to process what had just happened, his mind catching up too slowly to a moment that had already moved past him. And Sophia finally leaned back in her chair, her hands resting lightly in her lap. Once more, as if nothing unusual had occurred, as if she had simply joined the conversation at last. But the truth was already clear to everyone at that table. The conversation had not just shifted, it had been taken, and for the first time that evening Sophia Bennet was no longer invisible. Richard's grip on his glass tightened just slightly before he set it down with careful precision, the soft clink no longer casual, but controlled, as if he needed the action to anchor himself back into the room. And when he spoke again, his voice had shifted, not entirely shaken, but sharpened, edged with something defensive wrapped in politeness. "Well," he said, slowly choosing English now, as though reclaiming familiar ground, "that is impressive. I did not realize you were following along." A faint smile tugged at his lips, but it did not reach his eyes, and across from him Claire straightened her posture, her chin lifting a fraction higher, as she regained her composure, her tone smooth again, though no longer effortless. "Fluency is one thing," she replied lightly, switching to English as well. But understanding context is another entirely. Language can be misleading if you only hear the surface. The statement hung in the air like a quiet challenge, and a few guests nodded subtly, grateful for the shift back into something they could comfortably interpret, while Sophia remained still, her expression unchanged as she regarded Claire with calm focus, not confrontational, not defensive, simply present. And when she responded, her voice carried the same gentle clarity as before. "You are right, context matters," she said, and then after a brief pause, just long enough to draw every eye back to her, she continued, "Which is why tone, choice, and intent become impossible to hide. When someone truly understands what is being said, the words settled with a quiet weight, not raised, not forced, but undeniable." And Richard shifted in his seat, his shoulders tightening almost imperceptibly as he let out a short breath that might have been a laugh if it had not sounded so strained. "Come on, Sophia," he said, attempting a lighter tone. "It was just conversation, nothing serious, we were joking." But even as he spoke, the explanation felt thinner, less convincing than he intended, and Sophia turned her gaze to him fully, now her eyes steady, her voice still calm, but carrying a depth that had not been there before, or perhaps had simply been unseen. "Jokes usually rely on shared understanding," she said softly. "Otherwise they are just statements that some people choose not to question." Silence followed again, deeper this time, not awkward, but heavy with recognition, as the people around the table began to sense that this was no longer a passing moment, no longer something that could be brushed aside with laughter or redirected with ease, and Claire's fingers tapped once against the table, a subtle, restless motion betraying the tension she was trying to conceal before she leaned forward again, her voice cool, measured. "If you felt uncomfortable, you could have said something earlier," she said. "There was no need to wait." And for the first time, Sophia's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that it changed everything. A faint, almost thoughtful smile touched her lips, not warm, not cold, but knowing. "I was not uncomfortable," she replied quietly. "I was paying attention," and that distinction landed harder than anything before it, because it reframed the entire evening, not as a situation she had endured, but as one she had observed, one she had allowed to unfold without interruption. And Richard's composure faltered just for a moment, his gaze dropping briefly to the table before lifting again, searching her face, as if trying to find the version of her he thought he knew, the version that fit neatly into the space he had defined for her, but that version was no longer there, and the realization settled slowly, unavoidably, as the room remained still around them, the balance of control no longer where it had been, and not returning anytime soon. The silence did not break this time. It deepened, settling over the table like a quiet understanding that something irreversible had already happened, and Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, as if distance might restore control, his fingers brushing against the edge of the table in a small, restless motion, while he searched for something to say, something that could reframe the moment back into something manageable. "You are overthinking this," he said finally, his tone softer now, but carrying a strain that had not been there before. "It was a conversation, nothing more. We were not hiding anything important." But even as the words left his mouth, they seemed to fall short of their purpose, landing without weight, without conviction, and Sophia watched him, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a kind of calm clarity that made his explanation feel even smaller in comparison. "You are right," she said gently. "You were not hiding anything important." And for a brief second, relief flickered across his face, quick, fragile, almost hopeful, until she continued, "You were showing it." The words were quiet, almost effortless, but they settled into the room with a finality that no one could ignore, and Claire's posture shifted again, her composure tightening as she crossed her arms lightly against herself, her voice controlled, but edged now with something sharper. "That is a harsh interpretation," she said. "You are assigning meaning where there may be none." And Sophia turned her gaze to her once more, her expression steady, her voice even. "Meaning is not assigned, it is revealed through pattern, through tone, through choice," she replied. "And tonight there has been a pattern." A faint murmur moved through the table, not spoken aloud, but felt in the subtle shifts of posture and the glances exchanged between guests, who now found themselves witnessing something far more personal than they had expected when they first sat down. And Richard exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, the gesture no longer polished, but unguarded. "So, what are you saying exactly?" he asked, his voice lower now, less certain, as if he was no longer asking to challenge, but to understand. and Sophia held his gaze for a moment longer before answering her tone. Unchanged, but carrying a quiet weight that pressed into every corner of the room. I am saying that I spent this entire evening listening to how you speak when you believe I do not understand, she said. And what I heard was not complicated, it was not nuanced, it was simple, very simple. She paused just briefly, not for effect, but because the truth did not need to be rushed. It was not about language, it was about respect. The word lingered heavier than anything before it, and Richard's expression shifted again, this time more visibly. The confidence that had defined him at the start of the evening now replaced with something closer to uncertainty, as if he were seeing the situation from a distance for the first time, and Claire looked away for a moment, her gaze dropping to the table before returning, as though recalculating her place in a conversation that no longer followed the rules she had expected, and Sophia reached for her glass, again lifting it lightly, her movements calm, unhurried, as if the weight of the moment did not belong to her alone anymore, but to everyone present, and in that quiet, controlled space the balance of power did not just shift, it settled firmly in her hands, not through force, not through volume, but through something far more difficult to challenge, the simple, undeniable clarity of being fully aware. Richard did not reach for his glass this time. He did not adjust his cufflinks or attempt another polished gesture. Instead, he sat there still for a moment longer, then was comfortable, his gaze fixed somewhere between Sophia and the reflection of himself in the darkened window behind her, as if he were trying to reconcile two versions of reality, the one he believed he controlled and the one unfolding in front of him. And when he finally spoke, his voice had changed again, not sharp, not dismissive, but quieter, stripped of the easy confidence that had carried him through the evening. "That is not fair," he said slowly, the words measured as if he needed time to believe them himself. "You are judging a few comments taken out of context. People say things differently in different settings. It does not define who they are." And there it was, not a denial, but a reframing, an attempt to pull the moment back into something abstract, something debatable. And across from him, Claire nodded slightly, seizing the opening, her tone smoothing once more into something refined, composed. "Exactly," she added. "Private conversation often sounds harsher than it is meant to be. Tone can be misleading, especially across languages." But this time the agreement felt weaker, less certain, as though even she could hear the echo of doubt beneath her own words, and Sophia listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her attention steady, as if she were giving them the space to complete their argument fully before responding. And when she did, her voice was not louder, not sharper, just clearer, as though every word had already been decided long before she spoke it. "Context explains intention," she said gently, "but it does not erase it." The sentence settled between them, simple, precise, leaving no room to hide behind interpretation, and Richard's jaw tightened slightly, his gaze dropping for a brief moment before returning to her, his expression no longer controlled, but searching. "So what do you want me to say?" he asked, and this time there was no performance in the question, no audience to impress, no image to maintain, just a man realizing that the rules he relied on were no longer working. And Sophia held his gaze, her expression softening, just slightly, not in forgiveness, not yet, but in recognition of the shift that had begun. "I do not need you to say anything," she replied quietly. "I needed to hear enough to understand." And the distinction landed heavier than anything before it, because it removed the possibility of fixing the moment with words alone, and around them the room remained still, no one reaching for their glasses, no one checking their phones, as if every person present understood that they were witnessing something far more significant than a conversation, something that could not be undone or redirected. And Claire exhaled slowly, leaning back in her chair, her confidence no longer sharp, but recalibrated, her eyes flicking between them, as if reassessing the dynamics she had assumed were stable only minutes ago, while Richard leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting openly on the table, no longer hiding behind gestures or objects. And for the first time that evening, he looked at Sophia not as an extension of the role he had assigned her, but as someone separate, someone fully present, someone he had not taken the time to truly see. And that realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, quietly, like a door opening inward, revealing a space he had ignored for far too long. And Sophia watched him without pressure, without demand, allowing the silence to hold what words could not. And in that silence the truth settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet permanence that made it impossible to return to what had existed before the silence lingered. But it was no longer heavy in the same way it had been before. It had changed shape, softened into something more revealing, something that no one at the table could ignore, because it was no longer about what had been said. It was about what could not be unsaid, and Richard remained still. For a moment longer, his eyes fixed on Sophia, as if trying to understand how he had missed something so obvious, something that now felt impossible to overlook. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than it had ever been that evening, stripped of performance, stripped of certainty. "I did not think it mattered." He admitted the words, slow, careful, as if each one required effort. "I did not think you would notice." And the honesty in that statement landed differently than anything else he had said, not defensive, not dismissive, but revealing in a way that made the truth behind it unavoidable. And Sophia's gaze did not waver. She held it steady, not to challenge him, but to allow the weight of his words to fully exist before responding. "That is exactly why it matters," she said softly, and there was no sharpness in her tone, no anger, just clarity, the kind that does not need to raise its voice to be heard. And around them the room remained silent, no one interrupting, no one shifting, as if everyone present understood that this moment no longer belonged to them. It belonged only to the two people at the center of it. And Claire, who had once controlled the rhythm of the conversation, now sat back, her posture composed, but her presence quieter, her role diminished, not by force, but by the simple fact that the dynamic she had relied on no longer existed. And Richard exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, as if something he had been holding without realizing it was finally beginning to release. "I thought it was harmless," he said. "Just words, just conversation." And Sophia tilted her head just slightly, her expression thoughtful, as if considering that idea carefully before answering. "Words are never just words," she replied. "They are reflections of what we believe when we think no one is listening." And that sentence settled deeper than anything before it, because it reached beyond the moment, beyond the dinner, beyond the language itself, into something more fundamental, something that could not be dismissed as a misunderstanding or explained away as a difference in perspective. And Richard looked down briefly, his fingers brushing against the surface of the table, not in control this time, but searching, as if grounding himself in something real before looking back up at her. And when he did, there was something different in his expression, something that had not been there at the start of the evening, not confidence, not certainty, but awareness, the beginning of it, at least fragile, incomplete, but undeniable. And Sophia watched him for a moment longer, then shifted her gaze slightly, not away from him, but outward, toward the room, toward the people who had been watching, who had been listening, who had now become part of a moment they could not fully step away from. And in that quiet expansion of attention, the atmosphere changed once more, not tense, not sharp, but exposed, as if the illusion that had held everything neatly in place had been gently but permanently lifted, and no one at that table could return to pretending they had not seen it. No one reached for their glass, no one checked their phone. The room held itself in a fragile stillness, as if any movement might break something that could not be repaired. And Sophia let her gaze drift slowly across the table, not in judgment, but in quiet acknowledgement of the space that had changed around them, the polished marble, the soft glow of the lights, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass, all of it exactly the same, and yet entirely different, because now there was no illusion left to protect the moment from what it had become. And when her eyes returned to Richard, she spoke again, her voice calm, steady, untouched by the tension that had once filled the room. "There is something else you should understand," she said, and the simplicity of her tone drew every bit of attention back to her without effort, without force. "I did not learn French recently," she continued. "I have spoken it for most of my life." A subtle shift moved through the table, not surprise exactly, but recognition, as if pieces that had never been questioned were now quietly rearranging themselves into something clearer. And Richard blinked, his brow furrowing slightly, as he tried to place that information into a version of her he thought he understood. "You never mentioned it," he said, and there was no accusation in his voice, only confusion, the kind that comes from realizing how much has been overlooked. And Sophia gave the faintest nod, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "No," she replied softly, "I did not." And she let that answer sit for a moment before adding, "Because it was never something you asked about." The words were not sharp, but they carried a quiet weight that pressed gently against the truth of the situation. And Richard leaned back slightly, absorbing that, his gaze drifting for a brief second as if replaying conversations. Searching for the moment where he might have noticed, where he might have asked, and finding nothing, and Claire watched this exchange carefully, her composure returning in form, but not in certainty, her fingers resting lightly against the table. As she spoke again, her tone measured, deliberate. "People do not reveal everything about themselves all at once," she said. "It does not mean it was hidden intentionally." And Sophia turned to her, acknowledging the point with a small, almost appreciative tilt of her head before responding. "That is true," she said, "but there is a difference between not knowing and not noticing." And that distinction settled into the room with quiet precision because it shifted the focus away from what had been concealed and toward what had been ignored, and Richard felt it, the subtle shift in responsibility not placed on her silence, but on his lack of curiosity, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, as if the weight of that realization had finally found its place. "I thought I knew you," he said quietly, and this time there was no defense, no attempt to reshape the moment, only the admission itself. And Sophia met his gaze, her expression unchanged, but her voice carrying a depth that had grown steadily throughout the evening. "You knew the parts of me that fit easily into your world," she said, "but there is more than that." And the truth of it did not arrive as a shock, but as a quiet unfolding, something that had always been there waiting to be seen. And around them the room remained silent, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everyone understood that what was happening now was not about language, not about translation, but about recognition. The kind that comes too late to prevent the moment, but just in time to understand it. And Sophia leaned back slightly, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Once more her presence steady, grounded, as if she had already stepped beyond the need to prove anything further, leaving only the truth behind her, clear, undeniable, and impossible to return from. Richard did not respond immediately, his gaze lingering on Sophia, as if her words had opened something he was not prepared to face, and for a moment the noise of the city outside seemed louder than anything inside the room, the distant hum of traffic, the faint echo of movement far below, reminding him that the world continued even as everything in front of him shifted. And he leaned forward slightly, his elbows brushing the edge of the table, his voice quieter, now almost reflective. "Then why stay silent all this time?" he asked, not accusing, not defensive, but genuinely searching. And Sophia held his gaze for a brief moment before looking down at her, hands resting calmly in her lap, as if the answer required a different kind of attention, one that did not come from reacting, but from remembering. "Because silence shows you things words cannot," she said softly. And there was something different in her tone, now not distant, not guarded, but open in a way that had not been present before. "When people think you do not understand, they stop performing, they stop filtering, they show you what they believe is safe to reveal." She lifted her eyes again, meeting his fully, and I wanted to see that. The honesty of it settled between them, not harsh, not heavy, but undeniable, and Richard exhaled slowly, the weight of that realization pressing in as he considered what that meant, not just for tonight, but for every conversation that had come before, every assumption he had made without question. And Claire shifted slightly in her seat, her posture still composed, but her presence quieter, her voice, when it came, more measured than before. "That kind of observation can be isolating," she said. "Watching without being seen, it creates distance." And Sophia turned her head slightly, acknowledging her words with a small nod. "It can," she agreed, "but it also creates clarity." And she paused just briefly, her expression thoughtful, as if deciding how much more to say before continuing. "There were moments tonight where I could have interrupted, corrected, translated, but that would have changed what I was learning." Her fingers moved slightly against her lap, a small grounding gesture before becoming still again. "Instead, I listened, and what I heard was not just language, it was perspective, it was assumption, it was how easily someone can be reduced when they are not fully recognized." The room seemed to absorb that statement in silence, each person at the table now aware that this was no longer a private exchange, but something broader, something that touched every interaction, every overlooked detail. And Richard looked down again, his hand resting against the table, his fingers no longer restless, but still, as if he had stopped trying to control the moment entirely. "I never meant to reduce you," he said quietly, and this time there was no attempt to justify, no effort to reshape the meaning, just the statement itself offered as it was. And Sophia's expression softened just slightly, not in dismissal, but in understanding. "Intent does not always match impact," she replied gently. "And Sometimes we only see that when it is too late to pretend otherwise. And the truth of it settled fully, now not as a confrontation, but as a realization, one that could not be undone, only understood. And around them the room remained silent, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition, because what had started as a quiet conversation in a language meant to exclude had become something far more revealing, something that no one present would forget, even after the night had ended. The quiet that followed did not feel temporary. It settled into the room like something permanent, as if the conversation had crossed a threshold that could not be stepped back from. And Richard sat there with his gaze lowered for a moment longer, his reflection faintly visible in the dark glass behind Sophia, a version of himself that seemed less certain, less defined than the one who had entered the evening. And when he finally looked up again, there was no trace of the easy confidence he had worn before, only something quieter, something more deliberate. Then help me understand, he said, his voice steady but subdued, as if he had accepted that control was no longer something he could hold on to. What did you learn tonight? And the question did not feel like a challenge. It felt like an opening, an acknowledgement that he was no longer the one directing the conversation. And Sophia regarded him for a moment, her expression thoughtful, not guarded, not distant, but measured, as if she understood the weight of what he was asking and the responsibility of answering it honestly. I learned that you are comfortable being respected, she said slowly, but you are less aware of how you give it. The words were not harsh, but they carried a precision that made them impossible to dismiss, and Richard absorbed that, his posture shifting slightly, as if the statement had landed somewhere deeper than he expected. And Claire remained silent now, her earlier composure giving way to a more observant stillness, her eyes moving between them as though she were witnessing something she could not influence anymore. And Sophia continued, her tone unchanged, calm, steady, unwavering. I learned that you assume understanding is visible, that if someone does not interrupt or correct you, they must not be capable of doing so. She paused briefly, allowing the truth of that assumption to settle before adding, and I learned that you are not alone in that thinking. The subtle inclusion of others in the room was not accusatory, but it expanded the moment beyond a single interaction, turning it into something broader, something that reflected a pattern rather than an isolated mistake. And a few guests shifted slightly in their seats, their expressions thoughtful, their attention no longer passive, as if they too were beginning to examine their own roles in similar moments. And Richard exhaled slowly, his hand moving across the table before coming to rest, still his voice quieter, now more reflective. I never questioned it, he admitted. I just assumed I understood the situation. And Sophia nodded gently, not in agreement, but in recognition of the honesty behind his words. Assumption is often quiet, she said. It does not announce itself. It feels like certainty until something challenges it. Her gaze remained steady on him, not demanding, not pressing, but present enough that he could not look away from it. And in that moment something shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that altered the foundation of everything that had come before, because this was no longer about a single conversation or a single evening. It was about the realization that what he had believed to be clarity had in fact been limitation, and that realization did not arrive with resistance. It arrived with a quiet, undeniable weight. And Sophia leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed, her hands resting calmly, once more, as if she had already said what needed to be said, leaving the rest to unfold on its own, while the room remained still around them, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everyone understood that the most important part of the conversation was no longer being spoken, it was being realized. Richard did not speak. Right away his eyes remained fixed on Sophia, as if the distance between what he thought he knew and what he was now beginning to understand had become too wide to cross in a single moment. And the quiet around them no longer felt like pressure. It felt like space, the kind that forces reflection rather than reaction. And when he finally inhaled, it was slow, deliberate, as though he needed to steady something inside himself before continuing. I see it now, he said quietly, not as a declaration, but as an acknowledgement still forming, still incomplete. Not everything, but enough to know I missed something important. His voice did not carry authority this time, it carried awareness, and that difference did not go unnoticed by anyone at the table. And Sophia watched him carefully, her expression calm, but not distant, her attention fully present, as if she were listening not just to his words, but to what existed beneath them. And after a brief pause she spoke again, her tone softer now, but no less clear. Seeing it is the beginning, she said. but what matters is what you choose to do with it after. And the sentence did not feel like a demand, it felt like an opening, a quiet invitation that carried responsibility without forcing it, and Richard nodded slowly, his gaze dropping for a moment before returning to hers, his posture no longer rigid, no longer controlled, but grounded in a way that suggested he was no longer trying to manage the moment, only understand it. "I thought I was being respectful," he admitted. "I thought providing everything, making sure things were taken care of was enough." The words came carefully, not defensive, but reflective, as if he were piecing together something he had never questioned before. And Sophia tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful, as she considered that perspective before responding. "Providing is not the same as understanding," she said gently, "and respect is not measured by what is given, it is measured by how someone is seen." The clarity of her words settled into the room with quiet certainty, and a few guests exchanged subtle glances, not out of discomfort, but recognition, as if they were hearing something that applied far beyond the moment in front of them. And Claire remained silent, her presence now entirely observational, her earlier confidence replaced with a composed stillness that acknowledged she was no longer part of the center of the conversation. And Richard exhaled again, this time deeper, his shoulders lowering, as if something he had been holding for years had finally begun to loosen. "I did not see that," he said simply, and there was no attempt to soften it, no effort to shift the meaning, only the truth as he understood it now. And Sophia met his gaze, her expression unchanged, but her voice carrying a quiet steadiness that made the moment feel less like an ending and more like a turning point. "Most people do not," she replied, "until something forces them to look differently." And she let that settle for a moment before adding, "Tonight was not about the language, it was about what the language revealed." And in that statement, the entire evening seemed to realign itself, not as a misunderstanding, not as an isolated incident, but as a reflection of something deeper, something that had always been present, but had gone unnoticed until now. And Richard nodded again, more slowly this time, as if the weight of that understanding had finally reached him fully, and the room remained still, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everyone present understood that the conversation had already moved beyond words into something far more lasting, something that would not disappear when the night ended, but would follow each of them long after they left the table. The air in the room felt different now, not tense, not fragile, but settled, as if everything that needed to be uncovered had already found its way to the surface. And Sophia remained still for a moment longer, her gaze steady, her posture relaxed, as though she had already stepped beyond the weight of the conversation, while Richard sat across from her, no longer trying to fill the silence, no longer searching for the right words, because for the first time he understood that this was not a moment that could be corrected with language alone. And slowly, almost deliberately, Sophia reached for her glass, lifting it lightly before setting it back down, untouched, her movements calm, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed just enough to allow the truth to fully exist between them. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet finality, not harsh, not cold, but clear in a way that left no space for misunderstanding. "There is something else you should know," she said, and Richard looked up immediately, his attention focused entirely on her now, not out of habit, not out of control, but out of genuine presence. And Sophia held his gaze for a brief moment before continuing, "I did not stay silent because I was unsure of myself," she said. "I stayed silent because I wanted to understand who you were when you believed I was not listening." The words did not rise, they did not press, they simply settled into the space between them with a weight that could not be ignored, and Richard felt it fully now, the difference between being observed and being known, between the version of himself he presented and the one that had been revealed without his awareness. And he inhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling, as if the realization itself required adjustment. "And now you do," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a statement, and Sophia gave the smallest nod, her expression unchanged, but her eyes steady in a way that made the answer undeniable. "Yes," she replied simply, and the finality of that single word carried more meaning than anything else that had been said that evening, because it did not accuse, it did not demand, it only confirmed. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence no longer heavy, no longer uncertain, but complete, as if the conversation had reached its natural end, without needing to be forced there. And around them the room remained still, the other guests no longer shifting, no longer reacting, as though they understood instinctively that this moment did not belong to them, that whatever came next would not be shaped by their presence. And Sophia slowly placed her hands against the table, pushing her chair back. With a soft, controlled movement, the faint sound of wood against marble echoing just enough to mark the transition, and she stood not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that drew every eye toward her without effort, and Richard watched her, his expression unreadable, not because there was nothing there, but because there was too much awareness, now too many things being understood all at once without the clarity of what to do with them. And Sophia reached for her coat, draped over the back of her chair, her movements precise, unhurried, as if she had already decided what came next long before this moment arrived. And when she looked back at him one final time, her voice was calm, steady, untouched by anything except truth. "This was never about whether I understood the language," she said. "It was about whether you understood me." And the words settled between them, not as an ending, but as something deeper, something that would remain long after she walked away. And then, without hesitation, without looking back again, Sophia turned and stepped away from the table, her presence leaving the room in the same quiet way it had held it together. And Richard remained where he was, his gaze fixed on the space she had just occupied, the silence around him no longer something he could ignore, but something he would have to carry with him long after the night was over. The sound of her heels against the polished floor was soft but unmistakable, each step measured, steady, unhurried, as Sophia moved toward the exit, leaving behind the table, the conversation, and the version of herself that had once quietly occupied that space. And no one spoke as she walked past them, not out of confusion, but out of recognition, as if they understood instinctively that anything said now would only diminish what had already been revealed. And Richard remained seated, his body still, but his mind no longer anchored in the certainty he had carried just an hour before, his gaze fixed on the empty chair where she had been, the imprint of her presence still lingering in a way that made the absence feel heavier than the moment itself. And for the first time that evening, he did not reach for his glass, he did not adjust his posture, he did not attempt to reclaim the space around him, because something far more important had shifted, something internal, something that could not be restored by returning to what had been. And across the table, Claire lowered her eyes briefly, her fingers brushing lightly against the surface in front of her, her composure intact, but quieter now, as if even she understood that whatever role she had played in the evening had ended the moment Sophia chose to stand and walk away, and the room itself seemed to exhale slowly, the tension dissolving not into relief, but into reflection, as conversations that had once been effortless now felt distant, secondary, unimportant compared to what had just unfolded. And outside, the city lights stretched endlessly across the skyline, each window glowing with its own story, its own unseen moments of understanding and change. And as Sophia stepped into the hallway, the noise of the room behind her faded completely, replaced by a quiet that belonged only to her, a space untouched by assumption, untouched by expectation, where her presence did not need to be explained or defended. And she paused for a brief moment, her hand resting lightly against the door, not because she hesitated, but because she allowed herself a single breath, a moment to feel the clarity she had carried all along, now fully realized. And without looking back, she continued forward, her steps just as steady, just as certain as before, because this was never about proving anything to anyone else. It was about recognizing herself fully, without waiting for someone else to see it first. And back inside, Richard finally moved his hand, lifting slowly before resting again against the table, his reflection in the glass no longer something he ignored, but something he studied, as if seeing it for the first time. And the silence around him no longer felt like emptiness, it felt like a question, one that would not fade with time, one that would follow him long after the room emptied, long after the night ended, because what he had lost in that moment was not simply the illusion of control, it was the comfort of not knowing. And what remained was something far more difficult to carry, the quiet, undeniable awareness that understanding someone requires more than hearing their words. It requires choosing to truly see them before it is too late.